Hey everyone, Jameson here, and welcome back to the Nordic Sound channel. We're going to keep this review train rolling today with a new Scandi folk record from the Bülows Kvartett and their debut album världen, händer. If I'm translating that correctly, it roughly means what is going on in the world. Now, because I haven't done a Scandi folk review in too long, I want to preface this review acknowledging the weirdness of an American reviewing a Scandi folk album. The idea of an American judging Scandinavians on how well they are playing Scandinavian music is rightfully awkward, right? But I want to reiterate from my last video that my review philosophy here on the Nordic Sound channel is not one of appraisal, right? Instead, I use album reviews as an avenue for advocating for what I believe to be good music, and hopefully encouraging for us all to learn more about Nordic music traditions along the way. But also keep in mind that I'm not ignorant to Scandinavian or broader Nordic music traditions either, for obvious reasons. I study this stuff as an ethnomusicologist professionally here at CU Boulder, and as far as I know, I'm one of the very few traditional Scandinavian folk bassists in the United States. But I think that's enough prefacing for now. Let's get on to talking about the Bülows Kvartett and their debut album. So the Bülows Kvartett is a new group of young folk musicians hailing from Sweden. The namesake of the band, Adam Bülow, is on the violin or fiddle, Ebba Rubinson is on the clarinet, Joachim Vladis on the double bass, howdy fellow double bassist, and Nicholas Stefanis on percussion. So despite just putting out the debut album, which they kickstarted themselves and even earned a grant for, if I remember correctly, they were also featured at the Womex World Music Expo, advertised as mixing very old melodies with new and modern sounds. And that's sort of the name of the game here with världen, händer, taking traditional Scandinavian folk and twisting it in new, interesting, and often charming ways. So the album begins with a set of what I'm assuming are older tunes, just judging from the tonality of them, sounding very 18th century-ish. Stora Polskan and Orsa Nua Brudmarsch assert from the beginning that these musicians mean business and understand the tradition they're working in, right? I like this. I think it's a solid move to give themselves the street cred necessary to then do something more interesting with the tradition bending stuff as the album goes on, and there is plenty of that to talk about when we get to it. Now, I will say it's a bold move opening the album with these tunes from an accessibility standpoint, which probably doesn't or shouldn't matter from a traditional perspective, that's a whole other debate, but does matter if you're trying to reach a wider audience of curious listeners. Let's take a listen to Stora Polskan to get a better feel for what I mean when I say that these tunes sound like they're from the 1700s. As I said, these tunes sound very old and unfamiliar, meaning their more arcane tonality will probably sound unfamiliar or even strange to your average music listener, right? I'm saying this more for those of you watching this channel than for the quartet as like feedback or criticism, right? If you're interested in listening to this album but you're not used to listening to real traditional Scandinavian folk music, you might actually want to start with the third or fourth tracks instead, unless you're feeling particularly brave about diving into those more arcane or esoteric first tracks. But before I move on from these first two tracks, I want to make sure that it's stated plainly and clearly that I absolutely love the percussion throughout this entire album that really defines these first two tracks too, right? Coming from the world of Världen and Heilung while also being a traditional folk musician, I really love seeing what happens when you mix percussion with the more traditional stuff. Virelai is another great example of a band that mixes those two. I just think that the use of the drums on this album and percussion in general gives it another layer of character and flair that makes it stick out from the rest. And I really look forward to seeing what this group does with percussion in the future, because from the first track all the way to the last, the percussion is just such a wonderful addition to this whole album. So once you get to the third track and you're listening to Vals efter Fadern, you will quickly learn why I'm biased towards this track, right? It opens with the double bass, taking the melody and Joachim slays it, okay? You can probably tell by looking at a bass that it's not an inherently agile instrument like a fiddle or a clarinet, and it really takes a lot of dexterity and precision to nail a fiddle tune on it, of all things. So let's all give Joachim some props for delivering a melodic bass line excellently. But the bass playing the melody isn't actually the weirdest part of this track, believe it or not, because is that an umbira playing over the break in the middle of this tune, or some other West African thumb piano? I told you guys at the beginning, this album has a lot of twists and turns in it, and this track is where they really start to show the most. Then Kiersberg Marsch is the first real chill, happy tune of the album, more in the vein of like that Dreamer Circus style Scandi folk that's been pretty influential on the scene over the last decade or so. It's a pretty tame piece compared to the rest of the album too up until this point, but I think that's a good thing because it gives a much needed change of pace that keeps an album trucking along. I really love the interplay between the clarinet and the fiddle here too. Let's have a listen to this side of the album compared to Stora Polskan from earlier. And then speaking of a change of pace, this little tune tears seamlessly into Fährmanns Polska, which is the standout track on the album to me. It continues like that chill, mellow vibe from Kiersberg Marsch, but about 1 minute or so in, a voiceover comes in over the music to tell a story. Either the backstory of Fährmanns Polska, so many of these tunes have backstories with them, I'm thinking of Fanatulen has a whole poem with it, or the story the Polska might be written for. My Swedish is not nearly fluent enough to tell just from listening. The passages of the story are told in a really relaxing, well-recorded voice, and they're interspersed with beautiful musical passages. Really well done on this one, guys. A really interesting and fresh track to hear on a Scandi folk album, and this one really sticks with me the most. But then the last half of the album takes on a more traditional feel with tunes like Polska efter Ekor Andors, Polska efter Fadern, and När det snöade på Vitsepor. The latter being a very smile with a tear in your eye style Scandi tune that most of us know and love, but all these are just real solid tracks of playful musicianship between everyone that makes it obvious that the whole band is having just such a good time recording and playing this album. But there's one track that throws me for a loop. Mos och Människor. And I don't know how to feel about its place on the album. On one hand, 100% delivers on the mixing of trad and jazz promised in the liner notes, interspersing jazz verses with folk sections in between. It's also very well sung, which is the other switch up from the rest of the album. I really do like the song on its own, but as a part of the album, is it a little too jarring? It sticks out, and I'm not really sure it sticks out in a way that benefits the album. But with that said, the track itself is still a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed the exploration of a more direct interplay between jazz and Scandi folk. And I guess that takes me to the subject of critique that I might have of the album. I have some minor stuff that has more to do with how albums are organized in general here, rather than like musicianship or how the songs are written. So for the non-musicians listening, deciding the track order of an album is actually a pretty big part of making and releasing an album. And so with that said, I think this album actually could better disperse major and minor pieces. The way this album flows is that the first 3 tracks are minor. Then it's major from tracks 4 through 6, then that jazzy interruption with Mos och Människor, and then major for a track, and then minor for the closing track. I just personally think that the album and future albums would flow better if there were more frequent switch-ups from major to minor, rather than just having a big block of minor, big block of major. And then again, speaking of track order, it's a bold move starting the album with the more arcane older melodies. But that's far more dependent on what your priorities are and what's more important to you as a musician when putting albums together. If the purpose of the opening track for you guys is to assert to other more seasoned folkies or gatekeepers as soon as possible that you know your stuff, then opening with Stora Polskan is a phenomenal move. But it might be a little much for folks who are like just checking out your music. That said, I love it, right? But as I recommend this album to my listeners, I know a better first impression to outsiders or people not so familiar with the Scandinavian folk tradition might feel a little bit more at ease with one of the more familiar tracks like 3, 4, 5, right? Again, it's all perspective, so take this all with a grain of salt. So with that more critical feedback out of the way, it needs to be understood that above anything else, the Bülows Kvartett's debut album is fresh, fun, and exciting. It delivers on the promise of taking old traditional melodies and giving them a modern twist. The lead instruments are tight the whole album through, all the while the percussion and the bass add a groove not found in most other Scandi-folk records, and is a much appreciated switch up from what we're used to listening to. If you are a fan of Scandi-folk and want to be assured that the tradition is in good hands with the new generation, then I believe that världen händer is an album that is more than worth your time to listen to. Let me know what you guys think when you check it out, and I'll catch you next time here on the Nordic Sound channel.